Good morning, and I welcome everyone to the 30th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee. Please ensure all mobile phones are in silent. And just a reminder that broadcasting will operate your camera and microphone as usual. Please allow a short pause, though, before being called on to speak to allow them to do so. This morning I have received apologies from Gail Ross, and I welcome Gordon MacDonald as a substitute to the committee. And I invite Gordon at this stage to declare whether he has any relevant interests.
Thank you, Convener, and I have no relevant interest to report.
Thank you very much for that, Gordon. Today's main business is oral evidence from the Scottish Housing Regulator, but first, item 1, we have consideration of whether to take agenda item 3, consideration of that evidence in private. As we're meeting remotely, rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will instead ask if anyone objects. If there is silence, I will assume you're content. Does anyone object? I hear no objections. In that case, that is agreed. Item 3 will be taken in private. Agenda item 2, the committee will take evidence in the Scottish Housing Regulator's annual report on accounts 2019-20. This report was published on the 28th of October, and this morning we will focus on the key themes and challenges identified in the report. I expect we may also have some questions about COVID-19 in the social rented sector. And this morning, I welcome George Walker, the Chair, and Michael Cameron, Chief Executive, Scottish Housing Regulator. Can I thank you both for being here today, and I invite George Walker to make a short opening statement. Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for inviting us today to present the Regulator's annual report and accounts. My opening statement will take about 5 minutes, and then obviously we're ready for what you have for us. I hope you're all well in these unprecedented times, of course. Let me first recognise the really hard work being done by social landlords and tenant bodies who've worked tirelessly and going the extra mile during the pandemic. Also, all the volunteers who work hard on RSL committees. Now, let me highlight some of the work that we at SHR have done since we completed the period of this annual report back in March, just as the pandemic hit, really. I don't suppose it will surprise you that we acted quickly to respond to the pandemic. We moved our team to work effectively from home on the 17th of March. We immediately changed our regulatory approach from the 18th of March, postponed publication of engagement plans, and also all but the most critical engagements. We extended the timescales for regulatory returns. We worked collaboratively and effectively with our sector colleagues in establishing the Social Housing Resilience Group. We focused on monitoring the impact of the pandemic on social landlords, and we've now published 7 monthly dashboards that highlight the emerging trends. And we've been using this data to inform Scottish Government and the Social Housing Resilience Group. We've also provided advice and guidance to landlords on the impact of COVID-19 in their businesses, on cybersecurity, fraud, and of course on governance. Now, over the summer, we consulted stakeholders and took account of their feedback as we made further temporary adjustments to our regulatory approach, including extending 2 deadlines for landlords. The deadline to complete their annual assurance statements from October to November, and to report to their tenants and service users on their charter performance from October to December. We also published new advice for social landlords on completing annual assurance statements and on their business planning. And in fact, just today, we're publishing the next coronavirus guidance for governing body members, which will be live any minute. We also reviewed our own corporate plan, as you might expect, to reflect the impact of the pandemic on our own work. However, our priorities remain these: their tenants and residents' safety, homelessness, affordable rents, value for money, governance and the financial health of RSLs, of course. We've also published 3 key reports: a statutory inquiry report into Glasgow City Council's homelessness service, with important recommendations for Glasgow City Council, our national report on the Scottish Social Housing Charter, where almost 9 out of 10 tenants said, again, they were satisfied with their landlord's overall levels of service. We also published the findings from a national panel of tenants and service users. This has highlighted that some are definitely struggling with housing costs and with their wider finances. We're urging landlords to be aware of their tenants' concerns on affordability and to vigorously pursue cost efficiency and value for money wherever they can. Now, for the coming year, we'll publish more information on the indicators and risks that we'll consider in the next few days. I'm happy to say we commenced no new statutory interventions during the year. We now have ongoing interventions in just 2 cases, and both of these are coming towards a conclusion. And we're very grateful to all those involved, especially the 8 voluntary statutory appointees on the Management Committee. They all come from within the social housing sector, as you'll know. Finally, Convener, I want to highlight potential challenges ahead for the sustainability of SHR's future funding. I'll make no bones about it, this has been a challenging year financially for SHR. We're in constructive talks with the Minister and Scottish Government about that, and more importantly, about our funding for next year. It is vital that our funding is sustainable into the future. So I thought it was important I flag my board's concern about the impact and challenges ahead. Now, we're an efficiently run regulator, but 90%, yes, 90% of our costs are for staff. And of course, it's people that deliver effective regulation. So any cost increases from well-earned pay rises, or indeed from any other new costs, do disproportionately impact SHR. If cost increases are not met in our future funding settlements, we'll be faced with a very significant budget deficit next year and beyond. Our worry about that, of course, is that could present major challenges that could impact the type of work we're able to do, and therefore the protection of tenants through the effective regulation of social housing in Scotland. And I thought it was right to highlight my board's concerns on this to the committee today. Convener, I'll hand back to yourself for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Walker. For information, we've allocated just over an hour for this session, and we do have a number of issues we want to discuss with you. But some brief technical information before we start. There's a pre-arranged questioning order, and I will call each member in turn to ask their question for up to 9 minutes. Mr Walker, I suggest it may help the smooth running of proceedings if we assume that questions are in the first instance directed to you, but you should of course feel free to pass the question on to Mr Cameron. We may have a short amount of time for supplementary questions at the end. And please, could everyone give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak? Thank you, and we will now move on to the questions, and I will ask the first ones, which is based around how can you assure the committee that your statutory intervention process is proportionate and transparent? Are social landlords able to raise concerns with the regulator without fear of being targeted, for example? Targeted? How accessible is your complaints policy? And have you dealt with any recent formal complaints about how the regulator intervenes with social landlords? I accept there's quite a lot in that question, of those questions. Mr Walker.
Thank you for that. A good question. Well, as I said, we currently have 2 statutory interventions taking place. How would I reassure you that they are appropriate and proportionate? I suppose the key thing to say, Convener, is that statutory interventions are in fact the end of a process, not the beginning. And what I mean by that is that statutory interventions only happen after a long period of engagement and dialogue with an individual landlord around the concerns that are raised, and those concerns could come from their own reporting, from art, or through occasionally whistleblowing. Statutory interventions then only happen where a landlord either doesn't have the capacity or on occasion, I need to say, a willingness to engage with the issues that the regulator is concerned about. And it's at that point that a statutory intervention would happen. But to give you some reassurance, that is after often months and months of dialogue, engagement and discussion. So I would want to dispel any myth that there's any rush to a statutory intervention. Another couple of points that I would make would be one of the key tools that Parliament has given us in statutory interventions, and it's a tool that we use fairly regularly. We've used it in a fair number of the interventions, 12 interventions we've made, is the appointment of statutory appointees to a committee. Importantly, those appointees are all voluntary, so they're giving up their time at no cost to support the landlord in question, and they all come from within social housing itself. And on occasions, those committee members can be sitting on meeting. Those appointees, sorry, can be sitting in committees for a significant period of time, giving up their time and hard work. So I'll pause there and see if there's anything that Michael would like to add to what I've said.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Possibly just to pick up on the point around complaints. We have a complaints policy which is fully accessible from our website, and it is a complaints policy which is entirely consistent with the Scottish Public Service Ombudsman's model approach, and in fact we're just going through the process of updating our complaints policy to ensure that it is consistent with the new model that the SPSO brought out in September. And of course, we will make that fully accessible and available again through our website.
Okay. Have you I did ask the question, but have you dealt with any recent formal complaints about how the regulator intervenes with social landlords? I never got that one wasn't answered. Somebody maybe pick up on that.
I will come back on that, convener. Sorry for not answering that part. I wanted to set the scene first. The answer to that is, at the time there was some background noise and indeed a complaint to the committee and some questions in the media about the statutory intervention from the sector. I put out a call explaining our complaints process, which is laid out on our website, and asking anyone to come to me if they had any concerns, or indeed to go through that complaints process. Two people have approached me. One was a member of a committee of an organisation of which we were involved in a statutory intervention, and I had a long and fruitful discussion with that person. That lady did choose to go through the complaints process, and that is in hand as we speak. The second person who came to me was entirely unrelated to interventions. It was about a specific RSL, and it wasn't really a matter that the regulator could deal with, and we explained to that person how it could best be helped with, how it could best be handled. So those were the two things that have come up in the past year, in particular since my call for people to come forward or go through our complaints process.
Can I ask then, just finally on that issue, do you feel that, well, I suppose you would right enough, but do you feel that social landlords are able to raise concerns with you without fear of being targeted?
Obviously, I can't speak for individual social landlords. Certainly, the assurance I can give the committee, and indeed to all social landlords, and I have done this before, both in the call that I referred to earlier, and when I'm speaking in public platforms in many places, is that we would not target individual landlords for making a complaint to us. We're happy to hear feedback and take complaints. Certainly, I've had various bits of anecdotal feedback when I'm out and about doing visits and doing and meetings. And as chair of SHR, I would not allow us to be targeting anyone who made complaints to us. We're a public body. We should be open to scrutiny, and certainly we should be open to social landlords coming to us and making complaints. And I believe we are. We do get complaints from time to time. They've generally been a small number, and they've been handled. As you know, our complaints process is laid out on our website, as we've explained. And I think really importantly, at the end point of that process, should any individual who's got concerns rest with the Ombudsman, and someone can take that forward to that independent body and raise things. So I suppose that's a slightly longer answer, and the short answer is that I would be comfortable that we would welcome complaints and that we would not target individuals in any way.
Okay, see if there's a short answer and a longer answer. Give me the short one. Not bored.
Fair point, convener.
Okay, I just want to quickly touch on the issue of whistleblowers. How robust do you think the policy is on that, and how do you use evidence from whistleblowers alongside other regulatory evidence?
I'll make a quick comment and hand this one to Michael, if I might. I do believe that our policy on whistleblowers is robust. We do get approaches from whistleblowers, not infrequently. We take those at face value and we certainly investigate them. And whistleblowing has sometimes been the basis of some of the statutory interventions that we have gone through. I'll hand to Michael because he can talk about how we handle whistleblowing when it arises.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, George. Yes, and SHR is a prescribed person under the Public Interest Disclosures Act. So it's important that whistleblowers can make disclosures to us and that we respond effectively to them. Perhaps, I mean, it's worth saying that we consider each instance in its own merits. During 2019-20, whistleblowers contacted us on 16 occasions. By way of illustration, we took no further action in 7 cases for various reasons, including that there was insufficient information and evidence. And then we worked with the landlords involved in the remaining 9 cases to investigate and establish the facts. And during 2019-20, we did not initiate any statutory intervention, so 16 instances of whistleblowing, none of which have led to statutory intervention, but a number of which have led to engagements with landlords that have resulted in an appropriate approach to investigating the issues that were raised.
Yeah, okay, and just very briefly, if you can, how effective do you think the social landlord policies are regarding whistleblowing, and is there any improvements that require to be made there?
Again, I'll give a high-level response and see what Michael would add. Certainly, as part of our new regulatory framework, which we consulted on over a year ago now, we're in the second year of it, as you know, we raised the profile of whistleblowing and encouraged landlords to ensure that they had very robust procedures in place. Our sense is that those procedures are robust, but in some cases could need a little bit of improvement. Why do I say that? Because on occasion, when whistleblowers come to us, that's at the end of a frustration that maybe they have felt, and I emphasise the word felt, that they haven't been heard through their landlord's process. Michael, would you add anything?
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that we have, over the last 3 or 4 years, promoted the place of whistleblowing in individual landlords. It's an important thing to have a way where anyone within that organisation can raise concerns and be confident that those concerns will be taken seriously and appropriately dealt with. Most landlords have whistleblowing policies, and I know that this is something that has received quite a bit of attention over the last few years in social landlords. And I think, as George has highlighted, on the small number of occasions where people then feel they have to bring matters to us, it has usually been because they felt that the landlord itself has not had a system that they can use effectively and feel confident and safe in so doing.
Okay, right, lovely, thank you very much. Sarah, you've got questions for me?
Thank you, Convener. First of all, can I draw attention to my register of interest in relation to my former employment with SFHA? Welcome to the witnesses this morning. Can I ask you about the new regulatory framework and the extent to which it's bedded in a year on? Has it had the impact that you were looking from? And what kind of lessons do you think have been learned from the first year of operation from the assurance statements? If I could ask maybe George Walker first.
Okay, happy to take that, Ms. Boyer. Yes, I do believe the new framework has settled in really pretty well. I suppose there are 2 elements to that. One is up and running beautifully, which is the annual assurance statements. The second part, which is engagement plans for every landlord in Scotland, again has been effective and is in place. We're a little behind with one part, and that is the publishing of updated engagement plans and a regulatory judgment of organisations working towards being compliant, or being in statutory intervention. That was due in April, from the 1st of April this year, and that was one of the things we postponed due to the COVID pandemic. And we will pick that up again, and we will be publishing those plans and regulatory judgments from April next year. Let me come back to annual assurance statements, working very well. Landlords responded, I think, beautifully to them. They were due at the end of October last year. Most were on time. I'll be honest, I forget the numbers that were a bit late. It wasn't many. There was a handful of RSLs and a number of councils who came in a few days or a week or so beyond the deadline. There was one that was quite late in being signed off by its committee, but it was finally signed off. In terms of learning from that aspect, because this was a big thing, this idea of landlords self-assuring, really looking in all their dusty corners and so on, to use some of their words that have been quoted back. What did we learn from that? Well, in order to see how that had gone, we engaged with lots of landlords out and about on visits at conferences and on platforms, and heard their views. Secondly, we published a report after a series of visits to 10 landlords randomly sampled across Scotland, large and small, to hear from them what they thought. Really interestingly, most of them told us the process had significantly increased the level of self-assurance, especially in areas around tenant and resident safety and rent affordability, areas that they paid a lot of attention. We heard that landlords had taken quite a range of different approaches to reflect their own circumstances and to adopt the process of self-assurance. And the other thing that landlords said to us is that they were very clear that the vast majority of them wanted to prioritise feedback from tenants about their performance, and many of the 10 that we visited said that they wanted to consider going forward how they could get more involvement from their tenants and service users, of course, in that self-assurance process. So I would say that the whole framework has embedded very well, albeit the delay I referred to due to COVID. The final thing I'm going to mention is part of that new framework was the idea of a landlord toolkit to give landlords a series of tools and advice, and that is up and running. That is being done through co-production. It's being hosted by your old employer, as it turns out, that you referred to earlier, SFHA. It's hosted on their website, and we have worked with SFHA and other sector bodies to build that toolkit. The piece under construction now relates to one of the key parts of the framework, which is around equalities, and that was significant in the framework. We have funded a piece of work to develop guidelines around equalities and human rights for the framework, and that piece of work will begin quite soon. I'll stop there and see if Michael's anything to add.
Perhaps the only thing I would add is a quick update on the position this year. As George mentioned, we extended the timescale for the submission of annual assurance statements to November. And as at yesterday, we had received annual assurance statements from 82 landlords. And the deadline obviously is Monday coming. So we're still awaiting annual assurance statements for this year from just over half of all social landlords.
Yeah.
Thanks, Convener. If I can ask a quick follow-up. So in this year's assurance statements, you mentioned the importance of increased tenant involvement, and you mentioned issues about rent affordability. Do you expect those issues to feed through into this year's assurance statements, given the impact of the pandemic on people's incomes and their capacity to pay rent? Don't know, Michael Cameron, if that would be something you'd want to answer.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I mean, I suspect we will get some sense of that coming through from these statements, although I wouldn't be at all surprised if the impact of the pandemic, and in particular some of the impacts around rent and the levels of rent arrears and some of the wider cost implication for landlords, take a bit longer to work our way through. I suspect it might be into next year that we start to see some of the more fundamental impacts of the pandemic. I suspect that will come through in the annual return in the Charter, which, as things stand, we'll be due to get from landlords in May next year, and then probably the annual assurance statements next year. Having said that, we have said to landlords, we recognise that there is likely to be an immediate consequence of the pandemic and the impact on social landlords, and therefore the annual assurance statements do provide an opportunity to landlords, for landlords to identify to us where they feel they aren't able to comply with regulatory requirements, or they don't have a level of assurance that they comply with regulatory requirements as a direct consequence of the current situation. And it is important that they flag that to us so that we can take account of that when we are assessing their performance.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Annie?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. I'd like to move on to homelessness at the moment, and just to ask, why is there still a need for engagement with 23 councils on their homelessness services, given the engagement with a similar number of councils over the previous 2 years? What actually needs to be improved, and how can SHR help drive these improvements more quickly?
Certainly, I think it would be fair to say there's work to be done, as well as you've said, with that level of engagement across local authorities. There are clearly a number who at times are struggling to meet their statutory duties, and that's one of the prime drivers for that engagement. There have been a couple of very significant engagements over the last year. The top of that pile, if I can put it that way. One is with Glasgow, which we can come on to and give you any information that you might want on that, where we had a statutory inquiry, in fact, in 2018 in Glasgow, and we followed up on that this past year and have recently published a report on that. And the second was down in Dumfries and Galloway, where some really quite good news was published as a result of work with them, and we saw significant improvements there. I'll pause there. But suffice to say, we recognise there is more work to be done, and I'll hand to Michael for any further detail that he would like to add and meat to the bones.
I think, just to reiterate the point that you've made there, George, that this remains a significant priority for us. It will feature very prominently in the risk assessment of all local authorities, which we have just initiated, and we will continue to monitor and report on performance in this area, including on some of the new developments that there are around the extension of the unsuitable accommodation order. We will look to provide as much information as we can on how landlords are performing in that regard. I think it does remain a particularly challenging area for local authorities, and obviously the last 8 months have increased those challenges. One of the things that we have done through the 7 monthly dashboards that we've reported during the course of the pandemic has been to focus on performance in homelessness. And I think that's helped particularly those organisations involved in the Social Housing Resilience Group to focus where the action is required to deal with what is now a very significant number of people who are in temporary accommodation.
Annie?
Thanks for your answer. Mr. Walker, you mentioned Glasgow specifically, and I was just wanting to ask, what are the key messages from the recent report into homelessness in Glasgow, and how will SHR be monitoring the response to the report?
Okay, thanks for that question. I'll highlight what we've done in Glasgow and the key messages, and then Ms Wells, maybe pass you to Michael on the ongoing monitoring that he and the team will do. A tiny wee bit of background. I suppose throughout the whole of 2019, we were engaged with the Council in Glasgow about its progress on the improvement work that, in fact, we'd asked for in 2018 in the inquiry that I'd mentioned earlier. Our second inquiry began in December 2019, and then since March of this year, we've been monitoring the impact of the pandemic on the Council's homelessness service, and we continue to engage with them in that. What did we find? We found that the Council has made some important improvements since our last inquiry in 2018, so some important building blocks, but the pace of change has been slow, and the Council has acknowledged that, in fairness to them. The Council has also ensured that it does offer temporary accommodation to almost all people who require it during the coronavirus pandemic. But we also found that before the pandemic began, the Council didn't ensure that it had enough suitable temporary accommodation available. It didn't provide temporary accommodation to significant numbers of people when they needed it. And in some cases, the people that weren't accommodated were really very vulnerable and, more importantly, had approached the Council for accommodation on multiple occasions. Now, the Council has welcomed the findings that we published recently, and they've indicated to us that it accepts the series of recommendations that we made. And so I'll hand over to Michael to maybe just answer the second part of your question about ongoing engagement and how we'll move forward with the Council.
Thank you, George. And as George says, we've published the full report, including recommendations for the Council. We now expect the Council to act on our recommendations and to ensure that its recovery plan addresses the weaknesses in its approach, particularly to temporary accommodation. The Council has welcomed our findings and it's told us that it accepts our recommendations. So we're currently engaging with the Council on how it intends to act on those. And it will be that response from the Council that will then determine what our regulatory strategy is from here on in. So we'll be looking to publish an engagement plan for the Council that takes account of that response to the key recommendations set out in our report.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, is that you? Okay. Keith Brown.
Thanks, Convener. Inevitably, some of the questions I was going to ask have been asked before this point, but one issue I've noticed is your national panel, where you have various tenants and service users in consultation, covered the issue of traveller sites. My question is really around, I'm aware of at least one traveller site where there's been virtually no investment in the standard of the housing for a very long time, and yet these people are paying rent to the local authority, have done over many years. Because they don't happen to be in the housing revenue account, that investment's not coming. And I know the regulator has a role in that. I just wonder if you could say a little bit about the role that you have in that and what the issues are.
Thank you for that. Yes, we do have a role in that, and it's an important role. We published the first report over a year ago now, looking at if you like, the first line of response to the standards, the Scottish standards for traveller sites. And at that point, only about half, in fact, were in compliance. Some improvement has taken place since that time, and our team have continued ongoing engagement. That includes, as it happened, that ongoing engagement, a pincer movement with a visit to one of the poorer sites by myself and the Minister, to press home those messages. It would be fair to say that we have seen more sites come into compliance since our original report was published, but it would also be fair to say that there are a number of these sites, from memory, I think it was 4 in the end, where some of the challenges were really quite significant. For one in particular, I recall that the local authority involved was actually looking at having to, in fact, potentially move that site because the costs of meeting the standards there would be so significant. So yes, it's an important issue. It's an issue that SHR continues to engage on. Michael, anything to add?
Thank you, Chair. Just to add that there are 28 sites provided by local authorities and one by a registered social landlords across Scotland. 24 comply with the minimum site standards, as Georgia said, 4 don't. Fully comply at the moment. Comply across a range of them, but there are some aspects in which they don't comply. It's probably also worth saying that we are working alongside the Scottish Government and a range of other stakeholders to consider changes to the site standards, as I think it's widely recognised that the standards that are in place at the moment are minimum standards, and so it's about looking to see how we can in particular improve standards to start to approach something that's more equivalent to the standards that tenants of social housing can expect.
Keith?
Yeah, I think my concern is obviously it's an important role for the regulator to be able to understand what these standards are, how they're not being met, but it's really the regulator's role when it comes to the possible route through making sure these standards are improved, by which I mean if a council wants to move the traveller site onto its HRA account and the regulator stands in the way of that, then it means that the investment which needs to happen, and you know, the idea that people can for decades pay rent but not get the same level of investment in their housing that council tenants will get, for example, seems to me very odd. But it's the regulator's role in helping that happen. Why can't it be straightforward? What are the reasons that the regulator has for not allowing that to happen?
So my comment to that was the HRA account certainly has been an issue and is a known issue. I talked about a site visit I did with the Minister, and indeed local officials raised that on the day with the Minister. I would say that the Scottish Housing Regulator would never stand in the way of this, of the addition to the HRA account of traveller sites, as you indicated. That's not something that we would prevent or seek to prevent. We don't see that as part of our role, but we do recognise that there is an issue with those being, if you like, incorporated into HRA. My understanding is that some local authorities have done it and some have not, and that there was some confusion around as to the possibility of that. That certainly was my understanding from the visit I've referred to a couple of times now with the Minister, where there was a significant discussion on that today. Michael, would you have more detail on that? Because I must confess, my mind is hazy beyond that on this issue, which has been an important one, I know.
Yes, just perhaps to emphasise that there is no regulatory barrier to landlords, to local authorities, moving the costs of gypsy traveller sites onto the HRA. I'm aware that there may be dialogue going on with Scottish Government around some of the guidance that relates to HRA and how this can be worked. And as you've said, George, I'm certainly aware of at least one local authority that has funded improvements to gypsy traveller sites from its HRA account.
Yeah, last question, Camille, if I can, on a totally different issue, if I may. How does the SHR perform in relation to gender representation on its boards and also in relation to the gender pay gap?
I'll pick up on the board issue and the pay gap. I'll leave that one to Michael. We're very aware of the requirements for gender balance on boards. We don't stack up particularly well on that as we stand at the moment, and in part that's because one of the female members of our board just left us. My deputy chair, Anne Jarvie, left us. Sorry, I say just left us earlier this year. At the moment, we have, out of 8, we have 2 female members on the board. We had 3 previously. Where it stands, we've not been able to start recruitment processes. Our guidance from the Public Appointments Office is that they'll support us on that in the new year. In the new year, we will have the one existing vacancy that I've referred to, and we will have another member of the board whose term comes to an end in February next year. So that will give us 2 vacancies that we will pursue in order to help to address that issue. The second thing that we did to address that issue was, I have to say, with the flexibility and help from the Minister, is in our last recruitment round where we were seeking to appoint 2 members, a board member who had lived experience as a tenant and another from within the sector, we went forward and recruited 3 with the Minister's report, and 2 tenants joined the board at that time. One of those was female, which added to our quotient. So we're certainly very aware of the requirements on us to do that, and it's something that we will move to as high a profile campaign as we can in the new year when we're able to start the recruitment process again. It's very high on my agenda. It's something that I'd like to see. There's no debate. It's a weakness that we have for reasons as I've explained, and it's certainly one that I'm very keen that we're able to address. Michael, would you comment on the gender gap issue?
Very briefly to say that all of the employees of the Scottish Housing Regulator are civil servants and are all on the payrols of the civil service, and therefore, their pay is determined by that. So I would hope that what we do not have is any form of discrimination around pay in relation to gender. I can say that our senior management team has a split of 5 males, 4 females, so it's more or less balanced in that regard. But all of our pay activity is governed by the civil service.
Okay, thank you. Keith, any more questions?
Thanks, Convener. Oh, that's me. Thanks, Convener.
Right, thank you. Andy?
Thanks very much, Convener, and welcome to the panel. Could I start by asking you, because it's a little bit difficult to ascertain, exactly what is your role in relationship to rent levels and affordability of rents in social housing?
Now, that is a very good question, Mr. Whiteman, and I'll start, and again, as usual, pass on to Michael for the detail. This is something that is dear to our hearts. However, we have no specific role. We have no ability to change rents. We have no ability to apply rent controls. We have no ability to direct any individual social landlords, be they an RSL or a local authority, on rents. However, what we do have is an access to and an influence with social landlords around the issue of rents. And we use that in a number of ways. In particular, and indeed the board talked about this just, I think, 2 board meetings ago, in particular in encouraging landlords to really effectively consult with tenants around levels of rent and rent consultations on rent increases, and indeed to encourage landlords to give tenants choice where they can. That's not necessarily a straightforward thing to do. The second area where we have some influence is we can talk about it. We can raise the issue. I mentioned in my opening remarks today that some of the guidance from our national panel was that there are tenants who are struggling in general with finances and with rents. And I should say, by the way, that research was in fact conducted before the pandemic began, just to be clear. So that could be more challenging now. And so in my opening remarks, I made the point about encouraging landlords to be very aware of tenants' needs in that regard, and to engage with them appropriately. So an important subject dear to our hearts, but we do have limited levers that we can pull. Michael, anything to add?
No, nothing specifically to add to that, perhaps, other than just to say that, as you've touched on, George, rent affordability will be a prominent issue in the upcoming risk assessment that we conduct of all social landlords. and we have, on every occasion that is available to us, stressed the importance of landlords having an ongoing dialogue with their tenants around what's important to them, what they want, and what they can afford to pay for. We, as George has previously touched on, we'll be publishing within the next week or so the key issues that we'll focus on in our risk assessment, and rent affordability will be prominent in that.
Okay, and just to clarify as well that you are a regulator of registered social landlords. That does include, does it, wholly owned subsidiaries of registered social landlords? Am I correct? You would regulate their activities too?
We do not have any regulatory reach into unregistered subsidiaries. So we regulate the RSL. Now, some RSLs have registered subsidiaries which are also RSLs, and we would absolutely regulate all parts of the group there, but we do not regulate unregistered subsidiaries.
Okay, thanks. That's useful, because I and I think other members have probably have had some constituency cases in recent months over the past year of tenants of subsidiaries who are not registered social landlords, sometimes in mid-market rents, which seems to be rising very, very fast, about which there is very little regulatory control at all. Here in Edinburgh, for example, I represent Lothian. The comparator rents are in the private sector, and there's serious issues of affordability. So I understand what you're saying about the constraints on your ability to operate and to regulate rents per se. But will you be looking, for example, at the whole question of mid-market rents?
I'm happy to come
Michael, I think that's probably one for you.
Yeah, I'll come in on that. We don't have any authority or statutory role to look at mid-market provision. Our role is exclusively with registered social landlords and the local authority housing functions.
But where a registered social landlord is operating mid-market rents, you would have a role?
Registered social landlords aren't able to operate mid-market rents. They could only deliver that through an unregistered subsidiary. Okay,
that's very helpful. Could I just move on? I mean, you in your opening remarks, Mr. Walker, you talked about cost pressures, budgetary pressures, which I think we'll maybe return to. 90% of your costs are staff. Your median salary is £48,372, according to your accountability report. The median salary in Audit Scotland is £45,797. Could you say something about the sort of qualifications and skill levels of your staff that result in a higher median salary than Audit Scotland?
Okay, I'll maybe open in the question. That specific part on skill levels and stuff, I'll let Michael answer, because I wouldn't want to steal his thunder on that. But you're right. I did say some stuff, Mr. Whiteman, about our own resources. The challenge for us is where 90% of our costs are for staff, and it's staff you need to do regulation, isn't it? That creates a challenge. We've very minimal discretionary spend. And so that is an issue for us, as I've highlighted. As to that difference, I think that one of the key points I'd make beforehand to Michael on that difference is that compared to Audit Scotland, SHR is a relatively modest size organisation. And so, of course, where numbers of staff are quite different, it becomes, and I know that you know that, it becomes direct comparisons such as that as median to median become a wee bit hard, because in fact our median could change just by the movement of one member of staff. And so I think it's hard to give a hard and fast answer to that. What I can say is that, of course, we operate recruitment. All of our staff members are recruited through the Scottish Civil Service because they are members of the Scottish Civil Service. on those appropriate pay scales, etc., etc. Regulation, though, is delivered primarily by experienced professionals. We have a whole team who are qualified accountants in particular, who spend time taking apart the accounts and working with and supporting RSLs and so on the finances. And of course, when you're dealing with a cohort like that, that does come at a cost for those staff. I'll stop there and maybe I suppose I'll finish by saying that comparison, as I've said, is a hard one to make, although it's not lost on me the point that you're drawing. Michael, I'll leave it to you to comment on staff expertise and qualifications, if that's the right way to put it.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that point, I think it is important to flag that Audit Scotland is a larger organisation. It also has a much wider range of salaries than we have, and so those two things result in the arithmetic looking a bit different. We have a range of skills in our organisation, and we have drawn those skills from a number of different fields. We have people with experience and skills from social housing, as you would expect, but we also draw in skills with people with legal backgrounds, with backgrounds in economics, with backgrounds in other regulatory fields, to ensure that we have the range of skills that it's necessary to enable us to carry out our principal functions.
Andy,
sorry, I didn't hear the answer. Parliament Wi-Fi keeps dropping me out, but I look forward to reading that in the official report. Just for the record, Mr. Walker, you are correct. Now, I should just state for the record that I think you have 47 staff. Audit Scotland have over 250, so they're about 5 times the size of you. Thanks very much, Convener.
Right, thank you, Andy. Alexander?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. Can I continue on the funding issues? Can I ask, Mr. Walker, you indicated in your opening statement that you were having discussions with the Scottish Government. So can I ask, are you adapting your business case for the forthcoming year 2021 so that you are managing to look at what you are attempting to change within the organisation so you can adapt to all of that? And can I ask what kind of response to the business cases you've had from the Scottish Government, and how receptive are they to your pleas?
Yes, of course. I'll start, and again, hand to Michael, who's actively involved in these discussions himself with Scottish Government officials. This year's a challenging year. We had a modest cut to our revenue. We got some capital this year, which we were very grateful for, but a modest cut to revenue costs. And I won't go back over the 90% that we've touched on, but the challenge of that, of course, is there's nowhere to go to make savings, really. Now, of course, every organisation can save little bits here and there, but it's very challenging. And so I suppose I would say that the challenge of this is that SHR is disproportionately affected where new costs come to the fore, or hard-earned salary increases, for example, has happened last year for our staff, and who knows, may happen next year again if they go unfunded. With 90% of our costs being staff, that's very challenging. We've had discussions with Scottish Government on 2 things, including with the Minister, who we've had a very open relationship with. First, on this year, and the fact that we at the moment we're projecting a modest overspend this year, and Scottish Government are looking at that with us. The Scottish Government had identified SHR as an organisation with significant financial pressures at the time of the financial settlement last year, when we got the settlement we did. They were aware of that, and they had said that if they could assist us with that as the year went on, they would. There had been talk of some additional monies. So we are having that discussion with them now for reasons I've explained. The second thing we're talking about is what it would mean going forward into the coming year. As it stands at the moment, we're holding 6 vacancies. And as Mr Whiteman just pointed out, we have a staff cohort of around 4950. Depends on the day and whether you're using FTEs or numbers of folk, but around that number. So 6 vacancies with that total staff is obviously significant. We've no ability to recruit to those vacancies currently. It would be irresponsible if we did, given that we're projecting a modest overspend this year. And so we're having those discussions with the Scottish Government as we come into next year, because of course what I want to see as chair of the housing regulator is a financial settlement that makes us sustainable into the future. Because without people we can't regulate, and clearly if we're not able to fund salary increases and any other cost increases and move forward into next year, that is actually going to make us have to look at what type of work we can do. And I suppose, being blunt, my worry would be that we would have to change the work we do. We might have to move to a more reactive than proactive work, and ultimately that there's a risk that could mean that tenants and service users in Scotland are maybe a wee bit less well protected by the work of the regulator. Michael is active in these discussions now, so I'll pause there and let him add how the discussions are going. But my understanding is there's a very open dialogue taking place.
Thanks, George. Yes, indeed, we're having productive conversations with Scottish Government, and we've been able to set out for them financial projections that demonstrate the cost levels for us as we move into the next financial year and beyond that. And we've also been able to set out different scenarios around funding settlements and the impact that would have in the organisation. Very conscious that the Scottish Government at the moment is still working with a level of uncertainty around the global financial settlement, and indeed we might find out a bit more from the Chancellor today around some of that. Those discussions have been productive and positive so far, and we'll look to continue them in that basis.
Thank you. So you've identified the number of financial risks that you may be facing in the coming year, but the pandemic itself has also identified where you are as an organisation. And can I ask, are there any organisational risks that you, as a regulator, have identified? And if there are, how are you managing those risks, and what are you putting in place to try and mitigate them?
An excellent question, and yes, certainly risks abound. The financial risk would be the largest single risk, in my view, to SHR, for reasons I've explained, and I won't repeat them. However, the board is very aware of the fact, and indeed the executive and management team, of course, is that actually regulating remotely is challenging. There's no doubt about that. We are normally in a situation where we are sitting alongside those whom we regulate in regular dialogue in meetings. There are scenarios in which we sit in on governance meetings of committees, boards, etc., of RSLs, for example, and we can't do any of that at the moment. So there is a risk there that until we move back to a situation of more normality, the way we regulate is necessarily somewhat different. What are we doing to try to mitigate that? Well, a number of things. And the first thing was that we got our staff up and running, working from home very quickly. As I said, for the 17th of March, we did that. We were in a really strong position to do that because we'd had to work from home a couple of times before. We had to evacuate or exit our building for a significant period of time for a whole host of reasons I won't bore you with. And so staff were working from home, so we were in a good position. But we've added to that with pieces of technology support, the kind of things that you'd expect in order to support staff as this keeps going. The second thing that we're doing is we're engaging as best we can, in particular with appropriate membership bodies, FSHA, the Glasgow and West of Scotland Forum, ALACHO, and other key stakeholders, as well as tenant organisations, so that we are as transparent and we are as cited on what's going on in the sector as we possibly can be. So for me, these would be the two most significant risks that sit there. They are on our agenda, we're aware of them, and we're certainly trying to mitigate. Michael?
Thank you. The only thing I would add to that is very much picking up on the point that George said about we were well placed to respond quickly to the onset of the restrictions that came from the pandemic. What we are now looking to do is understand how we can build further our organisational resilience. Our people have been fantastic over the last 8-9 months in responding quickly to the changes that we have had to introduce. They've been working really effectively from home. But as George says, this is difficult, this is challenging stuff, both in terms of delivering effective regulation, when the normal approach that you would have to that of engaging directly face-to-face with landlords isn't available to us, but also just all those organisational challenges that you see with enforced remote working. So we're doing a lot of work to further strengthen the resilience within the organisation. But our biggest asset is our people. So it's about supporting those people so that they're able to continue to do the job that we need to be doing.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Alexander. Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks very much, Convener. As being a substitute in the committee, I just want to focus in on what Andy was asking about the accounts. I'm curious to understand some of the numbers comparing last year with this year. You were suggesting that your staff costs were around about 90%, but comparing your revenue budget with your 3.4 million staff costs would suggest it's closer to 78–80%. So I was wondering, one, how you got to 90% staff costs. Your salary basic pay is up 10%. Is that due to headcount or is staffing salary increases? And what was the reason for the 40% pension cost increase?
So excellent question, and it takes us to the heart of the challenge we have. How do we get to the 90%? Well, the accounts you're looking at are obviously at the end of the previous year. We're in a new cycle now. Why has it gone up to 20%? Well, a couple of things. First, there was an above inflation salary settlement for civil servants, as you know, last year. Well earned, let me say. I would think across the civil service and certainly for SHR, that was unfunded, so that added. There were additional pension costs due to the change and increased pension costs that in fact happened in 18–19, and some of that in the last year was funded by Scottish Government. I'm sure Michael will have the number to hand and can probably give it to you, but from memory, it was £120,000 of additional costs that were added to us for pensions, and we got some extra money from Scottish Government at the mid-year point to help cover some of that cost, cover some of those costs. That has not been repeated in the current financial year. So how do staff numbers get to 90%? Salary increases and additional pension costs, which are part of our staff costs, start to add up, and have taken that. We double-checked that, and of course added into that, of course, is board costs. We're all paid something too, and so we had a staff cost as well. So that's how it gets to the 90%. And the pension cost, I hope I've answered. It's about the changes to the funding of the pensions across Scotland. Michael, would you add with any more detail to that, if I've covered the questions adequately?
Yes, just on the 90% figure, what that is the fully costed staff structure if all vacancies were filled. including and then adding into that the board cost, which is a remuneration cost to the regulator, and taking all that together, that results in that figure of 90%. You're right, George, around there was a significant increase in employer contributions to pension in the last year. That was funded in part by Scottish Government, although the funding for this year is entirely falling on SHR.
And just my final point, looking at the 3.4 million staff costs as opposed to the 4.2 million revenue budget, which works out the 81%, these 6 vacancies that you highlighted was part of how you rounded up to 90%. How long have those vacancies existed? Because you do employ temporary staff on a regular basis year on year. So how long have these vacancies actually existed?
The vacancies in question have been running since the start of this financial year. At different points, they've increased up. One thing just to point out, you're using the figure of 4.2 million as the base for your calculations. That includes roughly about 200,000 of non-cash money, which is set aside for depreciation. So it's not actually money that's available to SHR. So we've used the denominator of the 4.085 in those calculations. So that will also go some way to explain why you're arriving at slightly different figures there. But that 200,000 is non-cash provision for, largely speaking, for depreciation of physical assets that we hold.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener.
Thank you very much, Gordon. It's been a while since I've been on a committee with you. I forgot just how forensic you can be. I've got one question to finalise. Does the regulator have any views on the RSL landscape in terms of the numbers of RSLs operating? And has statutory intervention been focused on smaller landlords, or is the aim of SHR to rationalise the sector through such interventions? Mr. Walker?
There's a broad range of landlords right across Scotland, as a committee of this knowledge, of course, knows, from the very large to the most tiny. I can tell you, as chair of SHR, I think that a mixed economy of different types, community, and, if I can use the word corporate, more corporate style landlords, is very welcome in Scotland and very helpful. SHR doesn't have a view on that or on that mix as to whether that should be the same or different. We certainly don't have any kind of agenda that would say that we would wish that to change in any way. In answer to your question, Convener, about the, do we have a focus maybe on a particular type or subset of landlords, if I can characterise it that way? No, I don't believe that's the case. Our current caseload right across all the landlords that we had been engaging with over the last year, although, as I've explained, only the most serious engagement is happening at the moment, has encompassed landlords large and small. We recognise that there has been some consolidation in the sector. That's not something that we wish to drive or have a particular opinion on. It's a matter of interest of the 10 statutory interventions, for example, because it sometimes comes up on that in that subject. Of the 10 statutory interventions that we have conducted, 6 of those organisations are still alive and kicking and independent. 4 of them chose to go down routes of perhaps joining another landlord. There are also, I think it's 4, although I'm sure it's either 4 or 5. I'm sorry, my mind's gone blank. I'm sure Michael will correct me if I'm wrong. Mergers that are being pursued entirely independent of the regulator at the moment, of landlords who are adopting a stance of looking at joining up with potentially another RSL, but that's something of their own volition. So, in short, no, it's not an agenda that we press. I think that a mixed economy across social landlords in Scotland is a very healthy thing. Michael, did I get my numbers right on the organisations who are currently looking at joining with others?
You did.
Well, on that positive note, can I just thank the panel for answering their questions today. That completes the session. I want to thank you both for taking part in the meeting. That was very useful as always. And that concludes the public part of this meeting. We'll resume the meeting in private on Microsoft Teams, and I propose we resume the meeting in 5 minutes. Please accept the clerk's meeting request for the private discussion, which will be sent shortly. You can now exit the meeting by clicking on the red telephone icon. I now suspend the meeting.